Imagine a man walking through the crowded streets of ancient Athens, carrying nothing but a simple cloak and a lantern in the blazing noon sun. Not searching for gold, not seeking fame, but something far more elusive, truth. He is Diogenes of Sinope, the philosopher who chose to live like a dog, and yet, his life would challenge the very foundations of society. Most people see Diogenes as a madman, a man who scorned wealth, rejected comfort, and flouted every social convention. But what if I told you his madness was a weapon? That every act of rebellion, every outrageous gesture, was carefully designed to expose the lies hidden in the hearts of men? Today, we will uncover the true story of Diogenes, far beyond the anecdotes of dogs and barrels. In 412 BCE, Diogenes was born in Sinope, a small Greek colony on the Black Sea. His early life is shrouded in mystery, but one story survives. His father was a banker accused of debasing coins, and young Diogenes may have been exiled or punished for this scandal. Perhaps it was this early encounter with injustice that set him on a path of radical questioning. He refused the comforts of wealth, the chains of family expectation, and the empty praise of society. By the time he arrived in Athens, the city was at its peak, a glittering hub of philosophy, politics, and art. Think of it, streets alive with merchants, soldiers, and scholars, debates in the agora echoing from dawn to dusk. It was a world obsessed with appearances, with status, and with power. And into this world stepped a man with nothing but his principles, a man who would live in a tub, eat scraps, and behave in ways the Athenians could barely tolerate. Diogenes' life in Athens was punctuated by shocking acts designed to strip away pretense. He would walk into a banquet and eat in public, ignoring polite society. He carried a lamp at midday, claiming to search for an honest man, an impossible quest that mocked the corruption and deceit he saw everywhere. People laughed, whispered, and sometimes threw objects at him. But in his audacity lay a deeper truth. Comfort and convention blind us to reality. One story tells of Alexander the Great himself, who once found Diogenes sunbathing and asked if he wanted anything. Diogenes simply replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." A king who conquered the world met a man who owned nothing, yet commanded a lesson in humility that echoed through the ages. This was Diogenes' power. His life was a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of those who claimed superiority. But living like a dog was not mere rebellion. It was a philosophy. Cynicism, derived from the Greek word for dog, taught that happiness comes from self-sufficiency and freedom from desire. Diogenes believed that luxury, status, and societal rules were shackles. To live truly free, one had to reject these chains and embrace a life stripped to its essentials. He ate what he could find, slept where he could rest, and spoke the truth without fear. Every barrel he slept in, every confrontation he provoked, was a lesson disguised as madness. Even so, not all were convinced. Athenians whispered that he was insane, while others feared his ideas. Yet philosophers from Plato to Crates visited him, drawn to the raw honesty of a life unconstrained. Diogenes' barrel became a symbol, not of poverty, but of freedom, a challenge to a society obsessed with appearance over essence. And yet, beneath the laughter, the insults, and the provocations, lay a darker, lesser-known story. Diogenes was not only challenging society, he was challenging the human heart. What if our greatest enemy is not wealth or power, but the illusions we cling to? What if the freedom Diogenes sought could not be given, but only taken, through a courage most could not summon? By now, you may be wondering, why would a man willingly live like a dog, beg for scraps, and scorn kings? The answer is far more disturbing and far more inspiring than the stories we have been told. Diogenes' life was not a performance. It was a revolution of the mind, a philosophical war waged against the very foundations of human society. And in the next chapter of his life, the truths he uncovered would grow darker, more audacious, and more dangerous. Because Diogenes did not merely reject wealth or power, he exposed a secret the most powerful men of Athens wished would remain hidden. After his arrival in Athens, Diogenes' reputation grew, not through eloquent speeches, but through actions so audacious they left citizens both enraged and fascinated. He lived in a large ceramic jar, often miscalled a barrel, in the Agora, Athens' bustling marketplace. From this simple abode, he challenged every social norm. People would pass by, shaking their heads, while he performed acts that seemed crude or even obscene to the polite eye. But every act carried a lesson. He ate in public, mocking those who dined with etiquette but devoured greed and hypocrisy behind closed doors. He defecated in open sight, declaring that shame belonged not in the body, but in the pretensions of society. He urinated on philosophers who debated endlessly but acted little. He slept in the sun, naked, indifferent to ridicule or danger. To the Athenians, he was the ultimate scandal. To Diogenes, he was revealing truth. Yet the man beneath the provocateur was far more complex than street tales suggested. Diogenes was a master observer, dissecting human behavior with a surgical precision. He scrutinized greed, vanity, and ambition, not from books, but from the chaotic streets, from the markets where merchants haggled and politicians schemed. He knew that wealth and status were illusions, carefully constructed to hide the emptiness of men who feared truth. One of his most notorious encounters involved Plato, who described humans as featherless bipeds. Diogenes plucked a chicken and carried it into Plato's academy, declaring, "Behold, here is Plato's human." Plato, infuriated, tried to argue, but Diogenes' point was undeniable. Definitions, titles, and abstract ideas meant nothing when stripped of reality. Every jest, every provocation, was a scalpel aimed at the heart of philosophical pretense. The philosopher's audacity was not limited to mockery. He challenged the powerful and the famous. Alexander the Great, who had conquered most of the known world, once visited Diogenes. The young king, accustomed to obeisance and awe, asked if he could grant a favor. Diogenes, basking in sunlight, replied simply, "Stand out of my sunlight." Think about that. A man with nothing but a jar and a cloak dismissing the most powerful ruler of his time, not with words, but with absolute presence. Alexander reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." But there was more to Diogenes than public spectacle. Behind the provocations was a philosophy of extreme self-sufficiency. He carried only what he could physically hold. He possessed no property, no slaves, no wealth. His life was a practical experiment. Could a human be truly free if stripped of all material attachment? Could one find contentment in nothingness? He believed so, and every day he tested the limits of human endurance, humility, and courage. However, living in a society that prized wealth, appearance, and conformity carried dangers. Diogenes was often threatened, mocked, and chased from the streets. Citizens hurled insults. Politicians feared his influence. The philosopher's very existence became a mirror that reflected the hypocrisies of Athens, and mirrors, as the powerful knew, could be dangerous. There were whispers, too, of darker moments in Diogenes' life, times when his philosophy nearly crossed into the extreme. Some claimed he deliberately sought hunger and exposure to test the limits of human suffering. Others hinted at confrontations with corrupt leaders, where he exposed secrets that could have endangered his life. These stories, largely lost or distorted, suggest a man willing to flirt with danger not for fame, but for truth. And yet, his influence grew. Young philosophers like Crates of Thebes were drawn to him, inspired by his courage and his radical clarity. Diogenes became a teacher, though not in a traditional sense. He did not lecture in classrooms. He taught by example, by confrontation, by refusing to bend. Every insult hurled at him, every scornful laugh, became a lesson. Freedom comes not from comfort, but from shedding desire and fear. By this time, the Athenians could not ignore him. Diogenes had become more than a curiosity. He was a living question, a philosophical enigma walking the streets. And as his fame and infamy grew, so too did the stakes. For in a city of thinkers, power brokers, and tyrants, the truths he exposed were dangerous. There were secrets in Athens that the philosopher might unearth, truths that could shake the very foundations of its society. And it was in this crucible of conflict, laughter, and danger that Diogenes' most daring acts and darkest revelations would emerge. The world would soon witness not just the antics of a man living like a dog, but the audacity of a mind unbound, a philosophy that threatened kings, tyrants, and even the gods themselves. As Diogenes' presence in Athens became unavoidable, his methods grew even bolder. He was no longer content with simple acts of mockery. Now, he sought to expose the rot at the very heart of human pride. People began to realize that his antics were not random. They were deliberate, surgical, and deeply unsettling. One of his most infamous acts occurred during a festival in honor of the goddess Athena. Citizens gathered to celebrate, adorned in their finest robes and jewelry, eager to display wealth and piety. Diogenes arrived, as always, unkempt, carrying nothing but his cloak and lantern. He climbed onto a podium and, in front of the crowd, began questioning the priests and magistrates. How can you honor the goddess while you hoard your gold, cheat your neighbors, and worship power instead of virtue? The crowd laughed at first, dismissing him as mad. But the laughter quickly turned to unease. His words were undeniable. Diogenes' confrontations were not limited to the public arena. He targeted philosophers, too, challenging the foundations of their teachings. Plato, the great mind of the academy, became one of his most frequent targets. Where Plato spoke in abstractions, justice, virtue, the forms, Diogenes demanded concrete reality. He asked not for theories, but for actions. One day, he interrupted a lecture on morality, pointing at the students and declaring, "You speak of goodness, but do any of you live it?" Plato, irritated yet intrigued, could only observe as Diogenes walked away, leaving a silence that echoed far longer than any speech. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Diogenes' life was his willingness to test the limits of human tolerance. He would beg in the marketplace, not for survival, but to reveal dependence and weakness in others. He would mock the wealthy by sleeping in the streets, eating scraps, and scornfully rejecting their offers of help. And in every encounter, he forced those around him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their possessions, their status, their respectability, none of it mattered in the pursuit of a meaningful life. His philosophy, extreme as it was, carried a kind of terrifying logic. By stripping life down to its barest essentials, Diogenes exposed a fundamental reality. Humans are enslaved not by kings or governments, but by desire and fear. Wealth, reputation, and comfort were nothing more than chains cleverly disguised as freedom. And the more people clung to these chains, the more he mocked them, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Yet, Diogenes' radical honesty brought real danger. Not everyone admired a man who openly scorned power. Corrupt magistrates and ambitious politicians began to view him as a threat. Some historians suggest that at various points, there were attempts to silence him, to banish him from the city, even to assassinate him. But Diogenes, fearless and unbound, seemed untouchable. His courage was as legendary as his cynicism. And there were personal sacrifices, too. By rejecting society, Diogenes rejected companionship, comfort, and security. His life was one of isolation, exposed to weather, hunger, and ridicule. Many wondered how he survived, and the answer was simple yet profound. He did not depend on anything external. His strength came from his own mind, his self-discipline, and his commitment to truth. In these years, Diogenes' reputation as the dog philosopher reached its peak. Citizens spoke of his outrageous acts with equal parts horror and fascination. Travelers from distant lands came to observe him, some mocking, others inspired. And while laughter often accompanied his presence, so too did reflection. People could not help but question their own lives in comparison. How many were truly free? How many were slaves to vanity, to comfort, to fear? But the philosopher's most audacious acts were yet to come. Beyond mocking kings and challenging philosophers, Diogenes began to confront Athens itself, exposing the city's hidden hypocrisies and dangerous secrets. He would uncover truths that few dared speak aloud, truths about corruption, ambition, and the fragility of human morality. And it was in this tension between man and society that Diogenes' true genius emerged. He was no longer merely a critic or a rebel. He had become a mirror for the city, reflecting its flaws, its fears, and its hidden desires. Every laugh, every insult, every act of defiance was a stroke in a larger, invisible painting, a portrait of humanity stripped bare. But what Diogenes would reveal next would not just shock Athens. It would challenge the very nature of power, of civilization, and of the human soul itself. And as the philosopher walked through the streets, lantern in hand, searching for honesty in a city obsessed with appearances, one question began to haunt all who witnessed him. Could any man truly live as free as Diogenes? By now, Diogenes had become more than a curiosity. He was a threat to the comfortable illusions that Athens clung to. People no longer laughed at him casually. Some feared him. His confrontations with the powerful were becoming sharper, his lessons more biting, and his life, in its stark simplicity, a challenge no one could ignore. One of the most legendary episodes involved a meeting with the philosopher Plato. Plato, ever the scholar, had written that the ideal human was a featherless biped. Diogenes, never one to mince words, plucked a chicken, placed it before the academy, and declared, "Here is your man." Plato, embarrassed but intrigued, could not dismiss the brilliance beneath the mockery. But Diogenes did not stop there. He questioned Plato relentlessly, pushing his own teachings to their limits. It was not just a critique of Plato's philosophy. It was a revolt against abstraction itself, a demand that thought meet reality. Diogenes' actions were not always verbal. He lived as a physical lesson in detachment, exposing the fragility of human pride. He begged openly, slept where he could, and owned nothing. People began to whisper that his courage bordered on madness, that his disregard for danger was unnatural. Yet, for Diogenes, these were the instruments of freedom. He knew that to cling to comfort or fear death was to remain enslaved. And then there were the powerful. Alexander the Great, now ruler of most of the known world, had heard of Diogenes' outrageous behavior. Curious, Alexander sought him out, expecting either ridicule or submission. He found Diogenes lounging in sunlight, relaxed and unafraid. Alexander asked if there was any favor he could grant the philosopher. Diogenes' reply was simple: "Stand out of my sunlight." Imagine that. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known confronted with the ultimate act of defiance. A man who owned nothing, feared nothing, and yet commanded a lesson in humility. But this defiance was not without consequence. Diogenes' radical philosophy threatened the foundations of Athens. Politicians whispered that he undermined respect for law and tradition. Merchants worried that his contempt for wealth would inspire unrest. Even fellow philosophers sometimes found his extremism difficult to accept. And yet, Diogenes pressed on, convinced that truth and freedom outweighed popularity or safety. As his life unfolded, it became clear that Diogenes' philosophy was not merely eccentric, it was revolutionary. In a world ruled by power, wealth, and appearances, he lived an existence stripped to essentials, revealing the chains that enslaved all others. His acts, once dismissed as madness, began to resonate as wisdom. To live like Diogenes was to confront the deepest human fears: fear of poverty, fear of ridicule, fear of death itself. And this is where the hidden story emerges. Diogenes' life, as we have heard it in anecdotes, conceals a profound struggle. He did not merely mock society, he challenged its moral core. He questioned justice, exposed hypocrisy, and forced men to confront their own weaknesses. Some historians suggest that he uncovered corruption among Athens' elite, secrets powerful enough to make him enemies who wished him gone. Yet he remained, fearless and unwavering, a living testament to radical honesty. Perhaps most shocking of all is the revelation that Diogenes' freedom came at a cost. The philosopher lived isolated, exposed to the elements, and constantly at risk. He had no allies in power, no protection, and yet he survived. How? Because his strength was internal. He needed nothing from society, feared nothing from men, and clung only to his philosophy. Every hardship, every insult, every deprivation became part of a deliberate experiment in human liberty. In the end, Diogenes' greatest triumph was not mocking kings or shocking philosophers. It was the radical proof that a human could live completely free, free from desire, free from fear, and free from the illusions that bind most men. And yet, one question remained. Could his philosophy endure? Could a life lived in barrels and sunlight survive the weight of a society built on power and convention? Could the truth he revealed last beyond the laughter, the mockery, and the awe he inspired? As Diogenes walked through the streets of Athens, lantern in hand, he was searching for something greater than himself, something that no king, philosopher, or citizen could give. He was seeking honesty in a world built on pretense, and in doing so, he illuminated a question that would haunt Athens for generations. What does it truly mean to be free? In the final years of his life, Diogenes remained a figure both feared and revered. His barrel in the agora had become a landmark, a place where Athenians came not to see madness, but to witness truth in its rawest form. Travelers wrote of him, philosophers debated him, and even rulers respected him, though few could understand him. Diogenes' philosophy had evolved into a living proof of freedom. He needed nothing, desired nothing, and feared nothing, not wealth, not ridicule, not even death. In a world dominated by ambition and vanity, he had stripped life to its bare essence, demonstrating that true power lies not in conquest, but in self-mastery. Every insult hurled at him, every laugh or scorned glance, was a victory over the chains that bound ordinary men. Yet there was a final lesson hidden in his existence, one that history has often overlooked. Diogenes' life was not simply about defiance. It was about illuminating human hypocrisy. Every king who bowed to wealth, every philosopher who preached but did not practice, every citizen enslaved by fear or desire, Diogenes held up a mirror to them all. And in doing so, he exposed a universal truth. Freedom is not given, it is claimed. There is a story, perhaps the most famous of all, that captures the essence of his final message. When asked how he wished to be remembered, Diogenes replied simply, "By my life, not my words." He understood that true philosophy is not written in books or spoken in lectures. It is embodied in action. And in living without compromise, without fear, without attachment, he became more than a philosopher. He became a living symbol of courage and honesty. Diogenes died in 323 BCE, leaving no wealth, no family, and no possessions. His death was as unadorned as his life, yet it carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. Unlike many philosophers, his legacy was not in abstract teachings, but in the example of a man who dared to live differently. A man who exposed the illusions of society, the vanity of kings, and the self-deception of philosophers. A man who, in living like a dog, revealed what it meant to be truly human. And perhaps the most haunting question remains. If Diogenes could walk among us today, carrying nothing but courage and truth, how many of us would recognize the slavery of our desires? How many would have the strength to reject comfort, status, and fear, and live as he did? His life challenges not just Athens of the past, but every society of the present, a question echoing through time. What would you be willing to sacrifice to be free? Diogenes' story is more than a tale of eccentricity or rebellion. It is a mirror to every human soul, a reminder that the trappings of civilization, while comforting, can blind us to the truths we most need to see. In the laughter, in the insults, in the sunlight and the barrel, Diogenes found clarity. And in that clarity, he offered the most radical gift of all, freedom through truth.